Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be exploring the intersection of science, politics, and big business.
Yeah, sounds pretty intense.
It is, and you know what? It's even more unsettling is this idea that uh, groundbreaking scientific discoveries are being suppressed, not because they lack evidence,
Right.
but because of politics or economics.
Huh.
What if the institutions that we trust, the ones we rely on to safeguard public health, are actually silencing voices in the scientific community, the dissenting voices, the ones that don't agree with the mainstream?
That's a scary thought.
It really is. And that's actually what we're going to be looking at today.
Okay.
As we dig into the career of Dr. David Lewis, he's a microbiologist whose work has stirred up a lot of controversy and has really shown just how much influence powerful institutions can have over scientific findings. His journey is really fascinating. It's detailed in his book, Science for Sale.
Yeah, I read that one. That was a really interesting book. It really shows you how economic and political agendas can sometimes just completely overshadow scientific integrity and public health.
Yeah. And before we jump into all of that, I actually want to talk about something else really quick. Have you heard of mindful moments? Nourish your mind on the go.
I think so.
Yeah, it's actually pretty neat. They use AI narration to give you these short and insightful looks in all sorts of complex topics.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And it's perfect for anyone who wants to learn something new while they're, on the go.
Yeah.
So think of this deep dive like a mindful moment, just, longer. A longer exploration of Dr. Lewis's experiences.
I like it.
So let's actually start with his early work on dental infection control. You wouldn't think that would be very controversial.
Yeah, it sounds kind of boring. But he uncovered something, a public health threat that was actually very significant.
Yeah, he found out that dental handpieces, the drills that dentists use, they can actually be really risky.
Oh, really?
Yeah, if they're not sterilized properly, they can actually transmit HIV. It turns out blood and saliva, they can get trapped inside those handpieces,
Yeah.
and then the next patient's exposed.
Wow, that's a big deal.
It is, and it wasn't just a theory. He actually investigated cases where patients did contract HIV after going to the dentist, and it was likely because of contaminated handpieces.
Yeah.
But when he brought this up, when he presented his findings, he got a lot of pushback
Really? From who?
from the American Dental Association, the ADA. They didn't want to hear it.
That's crazy.
I know it shows just how hard it can be to change things, even when there's evidence, especially when it means those institutions have to change the way they do things.
Absolutely. And it seems like he was always running into that kind of thing. There's actually an anecdote from a trial where he was an expert witness, and the lawyer, the lawyer for the other side was trying to discredit him. So he kept calling Dr. Lewis a man of science, like it was some kind of insult, using that old-fashioned language. But Dr. Lewis, he's pretty sharp. He turned it around and pointed out how sexist that phrase actually is.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about needing a more inclusive view of science. Just shows how quick he was and how committed he was to challenging these old biases, even in a courtroom. And that same tenacity, I think, is what really helped him when he started fighting against the use of biosolids. That was a big turning point in his career, and it led him into a much bigger, much more complicated fight.
Yeah. Can you explain what biosolids are for those of us who don't know?
Sure. Biosolids, it's basically treated sewage sludge,
Okay.
and they use it as fertilizer in agriculture. And Dr. Lewis, he became really worried about how dangerous that could be.
Interesting.
Yeah. His research found that biosolids often have this whole mixture of really nasty contaminants. You've got heavy metals, pharmaceuticals, and even pathogens, all in that stuff. And so, of course, he started wondering, how safe is our food supply really? And what about the environment? What is this doing long term?
That makes sense.
And as he looked into this more, he started hearing from people who believed that biosolids had actually made them sick. There was one story that was just heartbreaking. This young man named Shane, he got really bad respiratory problems after they spread biosolids on fields near his home.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and his mother, Joanne, she became an activist, really outspoken against biosolids. She's convinced that's what killed her son.
Wow.
And those kinds of stories, they really brought home the human cost. It wasn't just about data and research, it was about real people suffering. And on top of all of that, Dr. Lewis found that there was a lack of transparency around how biosolids were regulated. He kept running into this idea of what they called sludge magic.
Sludge magic.
Yeah, it's this belief that somehow magically all those contaminants in the biosolids, they just become harmless.
Really?
Yeah, and some scientists and regulators were pushing this idea, and it seemed like a way to just sweep the risk under the rug, to protect the interests of the wastewater treatment industry.
That doesn't sound very scientific.
Well, Dr. Lewis, being a scientist, was obviously skeptical. He thought it was just a way to dismiss legitimate concerns and avoid dealing with the harm that biosolids could cause.
So what happened? What did he do?
He kept digging. And the more he dug, the more opposition he faced. And he started going up against some really powerful institutions. And that's where we start to see the effort to silence dissenting voices, to shut down anyone who disagreed. Dr. Lewis discovered something called a compendium. It was basically a list of scientists who had published negative findings about biosolids, and they circulated this list in the industry to basically blacklist those researchers.
So anyone who dared to say, hey, maybe this isn't so safe, they were shut out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he also found evidence that some of the studies that said biosolids were safe, they were actually based on fabricated data. It's crazy how far some people were willing to go to protect their interests, you know?
Yeah.
It wasn't just about silencing dissenting voices. They were actively trying to create a story that went against what the science was showing.
That's really disturbing.
It is. And through all of this, through his experience with biosolids, Dr. Lewis realized that there's a system in place that often puts political and economic interests ahead of scientific integrity and public health. It made him start looking into other areas where corporate or government interests might be influencing research.
So what else did he find? What other areas did he look into?
Well, he started looking into things like antibiotic resistance.
Oh, wow.
The collapse of honeybee colonies, even vaccine safety, all these areas where having unbiased research is really, really important for public health and for the environment. He wanted to see if the same patterns were showing up in those areas too.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And you know what? He even experienced corporate influence firsthand. He got invited to consult for Steris Corporation. They make medical devices. And he realized that the way they were sterilizing flexible endoscopes, it wasn't as effective as they claimed.
Oh, so patients were being put at risk.
Potentially, yes. And when he raised his concerns, the company executives, they pushed back hard. They didn't want to hear it. It was all about protecting their profits, it seemed. But there's an interesting twist to this story. The president of Steris, after initially resisting, he actually decided to do the right thing. He put ethics first. He actually funded independent research to properly evaluate their sterilization process. It was surprising, actually, seeing that level of transparency and accountability, especially coming from a corporation.
It's encouraging to hear that sometimes people can actually make a difference even within these big institutions. It shows that speaking up, sticking truth to power, it can actually work, even when it's risky.
Yeah. But unfortunately, that wasn't always the outcome. One of the most disturbing examples that Dr. Lewis talks about in his book involves a study on lead poisoning that was done by Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore.
Lead poisoning?
Yeah.
What happened?
It was a really messed up study. They basically exposed children to lead-contaminated dust in their homes.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Like on purpose?
Yeah. It was all under the guise of, researching lead abatement strategies.
But they exposed kids to lead.
That's what happened. And they targeted low-income families, which just makes it even worse.
Oh my gosh. So what were the results?
Well, some of the kids ended up with really high blood lead levels. I mean, levels that could cause serious developmental problems.
Wow. That's unbelievable.
It is. And it's drawn a lot of comparisons to some really horrific historical examples of medical research gone wrong, like the Tuskegee syphilis study.
Right.
And even the Nazi experiments during World War II. I mean, it's a chilling thought that something like that could happen, that this kind of disregard for human well-being could happen in a society that considers itself advanced.
It really makes you question, whose responsibility is it to make sure that researchers are acting ethically? What about the institutions that oversee this kind of work?
Yeah, those are big questions. And in this case, the Maryland Court of Appeals actually cited the Nuremberg Code when they reviewed this case.
The Nuremberg Code.
Yeah. It's a set of ethical principles for human experimentation, that came out of the trials after the Holocaust.
Right.
And the fact that they cited that, it just shows how serious those ethical violations were in this lead poisoning study.
Makes you wonder how often this kind of thing happens and we don't even know about it.
Yeah, it's disturbing to think about. And Dr. Lewis, he sees a real connection between these historical examples of exploitation in the name of science and what's happening today, with this silencing of research that might threaten those in power. Whether it's corporations influencing drug trials or the government downplaying environmental dangers, the stakes are really high.
For sure.
His book doesn't really offer any easy answers, but it does raise a lot of important questions, How can we protect scientific integrity? How do we make sure that research actually serves the public good?
Those are important questions.
He talks about the wonders of science, but also about the terrors and how crucial it is to have independent research that's not being swayed by money or politics. And he connects it back to World War II, to the sacrifices that people made fighting for democracy and scientific freedom. And he says that the fight for scientific integrity today, it's directly linked to those sacrifices. It's about upholding the values that make those scientific discoveries meaningful, that make them actually benefit humanity.
That's a powerful point.
It is. And he's not just talking to scientists and policymakers. He's talking to all of us. He wants everyday people to be informed, to ask questions, to demand transparency and accountability from those in charge.
So we can't just sit back and assume that everything's fine, that science is automatically going to make the world a better place.
Exactly. He's challenging us to be skeptical, especially when it comes to information that's coming from people who have a reason to spin things a certain way.
Especially those in power.
Exactly. He says that scientific literacy, being able to think critically about science, that's crucial for a democracy to work properly. And we all have a role to play in making sure that scientific integrity is protected.
Makes sense.
Yeah. In the end, what Dr. Lewis is trying to say is that science is a human thing.
Right.
And like anything humans do, it's got flaws, it's got biases, but it's also an incredibly powerful tool. It can help us understand the world, and it can help us make things better.
So it's not about getting rid of science, it's about making sure that it's being used for good.
Exactly. And that means constantly being vigilant, thinking critically, and making sure that ethical principles are at the forefront of everything that's done in the name of science.
It sounds like Dr. Lewis's story really resonated with you.
It did. It's a really eye-opening book. And if anyone wants to know more, I definitely recommend checking out Science for Sale. It's really personal and thought-provoking. It will make you question a lot of what you thought you knew about scientific research.
Yeah, we'll be sure to include a link to buy the book in the show notes for anyone who's interested.
Yeah, definitely do that. And hey, while you're at it, why not subscribe to The Deep Dive too? We always try to bring you these in-depth looks at interesting and important topics. We do our research, and we always try to bring you stuff that will make you think.
Exactly. And don't forget to tell your friends about the show. Sharing is caring. The more we talk about these crucial issues, the better chance we have of actually making a difference. Working towards a future where science actually serves humanity. So thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.